This is the Ortur 4, and it's a pretty unassuming little 3D printer. And you might be thinking it looks a lot like a lot of the other i3 printers out there, like a TiVo or a Creality. But if you look close, there's some features in this 3D printer that really set it apart from the rest. With a build volume of 310 by 260 by 305, it's a little bit smaller than the Creality CR10. It has automatic bed leveling, filament detection runout, automatic power recovery, and these really nice linear rails. These rails are probably the best feature on the printer. They're a lot more consistent than V-slots and Delrin rollers, and they are so much better than linear rails and rods. The printer has a volume of 310 by 260 by 305. It has automatic bed leveling, linear rails, high-speed printing, filament runout detection, power out resume, and a BuildTak style print bed. The printer comes in two parts: the base, which houses all of the electronics, and the uprights, which has the X-axis as well as the lead screws. One of the best parts of the assembly is that all of the electrical is fed through these cable chains and plug into the side here where all the electronics are housed. And that's all pre-wired, and there's no way that you can mess up plugging these in. I did run into a couple of issues while mounting the Z-axis, and if you take a look at my build video, you'll notice that when I went to slot the rails in, they wouldn't go in all the way. What I found out later is that within the housing is the power supply, and the wires for the power supply run right near where these rails go in. So what happened was I was catching the rails on one of the power cables. And when I opened up the printer, there was no damage to anything within the housing, so that was perfectly fine once I got it fully built. But I would recommend while building to reach in through the opening at the bottom and just make sure that you're not catching on any of the cables. The only other trouble that I had was mounting these lead screws within the couplers while also trying to fit the uprights on the printer. And this is just kind of dumb. This printer is a whole lot easier to assemble than a full kit, being that it only comes in two parts and can really just take minutes to assemble if you know what you're doing. It does come with tools, all of the Allen keys that are required to put it together, as well as some blocks just to make sure that your Z-axis is even, and it comes with a filament snipping tool as well. For the most part, I'm pretty impressed with the build quality. We have a folded sheet metal base, which houses all of the electronics. All the wiring is pre-done for you. We have these pretty good cable trays, cable chains. Each of the axes use the same type of linear rail, so we get really smooth movement throughout. The aluminum bed heats up pretty fast. This is a 24-volt machine, so everything tends to heat up pretty quickly. The BuildTak style plate and material on there holds the prints really well. I actually had to drop my standard temperature down to 40 degrees because things were sticking too well, and I was actually starting to rip off the bottom of my prints when I was trying to remove them. And I didn't have any issues printing with PLA or PETG. Now, one thing I will note is that I had a little bit of trouble with ABS, but that was mostly because the bed is firmware limited to only go up to 80 degrees, which you can adjust later on if you want to go into the firmware settings. Out of the box, things were pretty impressive. Admittedly, the first filament that I used was a brand new roll of wood filament that I had never tried before, and it came out a little bit stringy, but that has more to do with the filament and settings than the printer itself. But even then, it came out pretty good. This group bust came out, well, about as well as you would expect for a first print. And then printing in iPrint3D's pastel green, this one with the exact same settings, exact same G-code, came out even better. So on to one of my favorite prints, which is the Medieval Castle by Bold Machines on Thingiverse. So I really like this model because it can showcase phenomenal detail on a really good printer or spectacular failure on a printer that's not calibrated well. One thing to notice is that a lot of the small details struggled. So when you take a look at this print and you see that some of the very thin columns didn't print very well, part of that has to do with this being a Bowden printer. Now, Bowden tends to struggle with that even if you do have your retraction settings just right, because there's still some delay or possible delay when refeeding the filament. That said, I think this came out really well. I noticed when printing a 3D Benchy that there was a little bit of salmon skinning, and that has to do with the fact that they use the Pololu style A4988 style drivers. Those are the really old original drivers that are found on a lot of older RepRap machines and are really cheap, but they tend to have voltage spiking and they tend to not hold as well on your micro steps as a lot of the newer stepper drivers. So one thing that you will notice is that a lot of the edges on the Benchy aren't entirely smooth, and this can be fixed with TL smoothers. Another thing is that the drivers are actually fixed to the board, so there's no way to just swap those out without doing an entire board swap. Another thing is that I pretty much had to create an entire Simplify 3D profile from scratch because the one that they sent on the micro SD card was pretty much unusable. One weird thing that they did was they had extra restart after retraction, which really ended up with some bad results. For the most part, things were fairly issue-free, other than a couple of times when the nozzle crashed into the bed. That was because there was a little bit of a disconnect somewhere between the ZN stop and the motherboard, but all I needed to do was open up the bottom, make sure everything was seated properly, and that was fixed. The only other issue I ran into was the print cooling fan dying. And if you print with PLA a lot, you'll know that that's a pretty important fan. This came up after only 3 weeks of printing. So one thing that I would recommend, and I would actually recommend to Ortur as well for the new iterations of the machine, is to replace that blower with one with dual ball bearings. The one that's in here is just a sleeve bearing, and I've had horrible luck with sleeve bearing blowers in the past. Even on higher end printers like the Raptor 2, they just die. So I've replaced them on that. And I would recommend you do the same on this one as well. And finally, there's a few things that I'm a little bit concerned about with this printer, but wouldn't be considered deal breakers. First off is this really weird mounting location for the spool holder. Now the extruder is fed right here. So if you're gonna mount your spool up here, the spool actually needs to feed through the filament runout detection over here and into the extruder. Now when your print head's down here, it's looping all the way like this, so this really isn't a good place. Not to mention that just in general, mounting the spool on top of your printer isn't a bad idea, because if it gets snagged, you can actually pull it down and deform your frame if your motor is strong enough. A couple other things to note is that the belt on the x-axis doesn't lay completely flat. So just a little bit of a design flaw. It doesn't really affect printing all that much, even if you get to the extremes like your 0 and right at the end. There's not so much angle in the belt that it's going to cause a lot of issues or any at all, and you probably won't even notice. And speaking of belts, on the y-axis, there seems to be a tensioning spring on the belt, even though they have a built-in tensioner which you can adjust yourself. So I don't know why they're including a tensioning spring, because I don't think they're very good ideas at all, because they can introduce a little bit of play within that belt, and they don't do a particularly good job of tensioning. Aside from that, as I mentioned earlier, it's probably a good idea to add TL smoothers to this since it's using older drivers, and maybe in the future doing a board swap. What I love about this printer is that it is such a good platform. It is extremely hackable. I would absolutely love to see someone do a board swap, to do a direct drive extruder, probably a higher end board like a Duet or a Smoothie board or some sort of 32-bit, and just to quiet it down. So if you're looking for an alternative to the CR10 and all of its clones, then this is actually a pretty good option for you. If you want to go up in price range from something like the Ender 3, then this might just fit the bill. Really, with the print quality and with the consistency that you can get with the automatic bed leveling, then it really is probably one of the better 3D printers under $500. Now, if I can trust this thing to just hit print and walk away and trust it to complete its print, and then when I show up it's ready, then it's pretty much a win in my books. So this printer was sent to me by Salon Electronics for the purpose of this review. They didn't pay me to say any of this. I genuinely really like this machine and would really recommend it, especially if you want to do something like put a direct drive extruder on it or do a board swap. I'd really love to see someone put in like a 32-bit controller, or maybe go all out and put in a Duet and put in a Titan extruder and the entire works. Then this thing would be absolutely amazing. I also want to say thank you to the 3D Printing Club for making this review happen. Go check them out on Facebook and online at 3dpc.tech. I'm Nathan with 3D Guys, and this has been the Order 4 review.